Thank you. Yes, my name is Beth McLachlan. I am from the City of Melbourne in Victoria in Australia. And I'm going to tell a little bit of a different story. We haven't had a major storm event like the one that the two that we've been hearing about. Some of our challenges that we've been adapting to have been focused around heat, drought and water scarcity. So I'm going to tell a slightly different story. So I'm just going to go through some of our current and future projections around drought, extreme heat and fire. And fire is another key challenge associated with extreme heat and wind. And then I'll just tell you a little bit about what my organisation, City of Melbourne, is working on in this space, and also, I guess, what we're doing with the community, and then what other organisations are also working on with regards to trying to manage these risks. So with regards to the City of Melbourne, it is the capital city of Victoria. For those of you who don't know, I've got a little map of Australia down here, and we're in the very bottom corner of the east coast of Australia. And we are the second largest city in Australia. The municipality of Melbourne is actually reasonably small, and I've put a map over there, but it covers 37.6 square kilometres, and only has a residential population of just over 100,000 people. But we are the CBD, so during the middle of a working day, we actually have a population of about 1 million people. But the entire metropolitan Melbourne is about 4 million people. And to give you some context, the entire population of Australia is 22 million. But we're a very multicultural city. 47.5% of our residents were born outside Australia. And we do have over 1 million international visitors every year, so very, very multicultural group. Back in 2009, we released our climate change adaptation strategy, which I won't go into in a lot of detail, but basically that identified the 4 key risk areas that we're facing in inner Melbourne. And those 4 key risk areas are drought, which is up in the corner there. It's one of our major dams, quite a low storage. Extreme storm events, extreme flooding, heat waves, and associated with heat waves, bushfires and air quality, and then sea level rise. And as I mentioned, today I'm going to specifically focus on the drought and the heat challenges that we're facing. So moving straight into the drought challenges, we've been going through a long-term drying trend, and it's got a number of names, but the Big Dry or the Millennium Drought, we do realise that that's more than 10 years, but from 1997 to 2009, we had quite an extreme drought, and our largest reservoir, the Thomson Dam, got down to 16%, and that is about 2 months' worth of water for Melbourne, for the entire metropolitan Melbourne, so the 4 million people. We got down to about 2 months' worth of water left, so it was quite a serious challenge at that time, but it also had major implications for our sort of surrounding rural areas, so a major reduction in livestock and grain production, so there's obviously food implications for Melbourne associated with that, and significant reduction in rainfall, specifically in autumn and winter. But we have been experiencing this sort of longer-term drying trend. As you can see, even though obviously very, very variable weather in Melbourne, we have been overall moving towards a drier climate. With regards to the projections, looking forward, we've done some analysis working with the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia, and have identified that we are looking at a reduction in rainfall throughout the entire year. I won't read out the numbers, you can see them, but basically across the average by 2070, we're looking at a reduction of just over 10% in rainfall. Having said that, when we do get this rainfall, we're going to get it in much more intense bursts. So we're looking at having a lot more storm events, but a lot less water overall. So that's a major infrastructure challenge in itself. And yes, with regards to the stream flow into the water supply catchments, obviously that's a continued challenge for Melbourne, and that could be reduced up to 11% by 2020 and as much as 35% by 2050. So that challenge that we've just experienced with the Millennium Drought, we're looking at facing that on an ongoing basis, and even more so. So major infrastructure challenges around water security and diversifying our water supply. The City of Melbourne, as a municipality, has a responsibility to look after the parks and gardens, drainage infrastructure, community services, etc. So some of the things that we're doing is trying to install a lot more water-sensitive urban design infrastructure into our city. Being responsible for the parks and gardens, we are the biggest single water user in our municipality. And during the Millennium Drought, we weren't actually allowed to water in our parks and gardens, so that caused extreme stress on the trees and on the parks. A lot of them died, and a lot of them are still quite stressed from that. So what we're doing now is looking at alternative water sources or fit for purpose water use, and making sure that we're not necessarily using all our clean potable drinking water to keep our gardens going. We're looking at stormwater harvesting, sewer mining, etc., and trying to install some much more effective water-sensitive urban design into our parks and gardens, and also on our streetscapes, because obviously the stormwater travelling down your streets is a good source to keep your street trees alive. We also have made a change to our planning scheme, which requires all new buildings to have a certain level of water efficiency in them, both residential and commercial buildings. And another thing that we do is around sort of our sporting facilities and parks, looking at moving those to artificial turf and things like that. So you don't actually have those sporting grounds that you have to keep watered all the time to keep them alive. But with regards to other actions, we have recently had our desalination plant open, and that's capable of supplying just under 43% of the entire metropolitan Melbourne's water requirements, or 150 billion litres, and it does have the capacity to be extended if necessary. That was a very controversial decision, but when we got down to the sort of 2 months water supply, that's when the decision was made to we had to do something. And water restrictions came into play very, very quickly. And as you can see, I've sort of put here the stage 1 water restrictions started in August 2006. We very quickly jumped to stage 2, and each stage should have just more restrictions around how and when you can use water. Stage 3, they didn't want to go to stage 4, so we called it 3A. And we stayed in stage 3A for a very long time. And 3A basically involves you're not allowed to water any of your lawns. You're only allowed to use certain types of equipment to water your plants, to wash cars. You're not allowed to fill pools. People were only allowed to water their gardens on certain days, depending on the number on the street that they were. So odd houses had certain days, and even houses had other days. So it was very, very strong restrictions. And there was also a very effective community engagement program in place at that time, which involved a campaign around Target 155, which encouraged residents of Melbourne to only use 155 litres of water per day. And before we started, we were over 200, and we actually got that below 155, and there was a lot of community involvement in that. I think although this wasn't sort of as dramatic as some of the storm events we've heard about, I think the residents of Melbourne actually realised how serious this situation actually became, and they were very, very involved in actually following the rules that were put in place. But in April 2010, we went back down to stage 3 and then stage 2, and now we have permanent water saving rules in place, which are almost just common sense. So if you don't water your garden in the middle of the day when there's a lot of evaporation, you water it in the evening when the water's going to absorb into the soil and into the plants. There's rules around the types of water infrastructure you have, so your shower heads and your flow restrictors and your types of nozzles you can wash your car with and things like that. So it's all very common sense. And yeah, the desal plant is now up and running, so we have that sort of level of security as well. Moving on to heat, the current conditions that we're facing here, the days over 35 degrees, they're already increasing. So when we actually did the projections, it was at 10, and we were projecting that it would move to 13 days over 35 degrees by 2020, I believe. But we've actually already met that. So it's heating up a lot faster than we thought it would be. The average temperature in Victoria has already increased by 0.8 of a degree since 1950, so we're already feeling that heat change. And the critical infrastructure in Melbourne, a lot of it it's not designed for extreme heat. Throughout most of the year, we don't have this extreme heat, so we're quite a temperate climate. During the winter, we sort of get down to about 10 degrees. During the summer, it's sort of maybe low 30s. But we do start getting these extreme heat waves where we have a number of days where you've got over 35, and that's when some of our infrastructure starts to struggle. We've done a bit of work around projecting the changes in single heat days, but also heat waves. And heat waves are where we actually see our biggest challenges and our biggest impacts. And as you can see, for each of these, the days over 30, 35 and 40 and the heat waves over those are just increasing quite dramatically, and we have some serious challenges ahead with regards to these numbers. And what our infrastructure is going to have to be dealing with by 2050 and 2070. But as a bit of an example, the 2009 heatwave is one of the most dramatic, I guess, and it was late January, early February in 2009. And on the 30th of January, over 500,000 Melbourne residents lost power, and then the heatwave continued for almost a week. It cost around 100 million Australian dollars to the economy. We had 1,300 train services cancelled, and it culminated in Black Saturday fires, which I'm not sure how many people have heard about, but they were quite a dramatic fire event in just out of Melbourne in Victoria, and 173 people died and 414 were injured, and there were some quite scary fires. There was basically two fire fronts that met and were moving extremely quickly. So Australia, and I'll go into it in just a second, but Australia has a very strong culture around being prepared for and aware of fire risk. But this particular fire was quite extreme and quite unexpected. 400 individual fires. But one thing that's not really covered in the media and that didn't get a lot of attention at the time is that although the 173 people dying in the fire, obviously a very horrific event, there was 364 people who actually died due to the heat wave in the week before, and that didn't get any sort of media coverage, and that's obviously a huge challenge when you look at the projections around the number of heat waves and heat days we're going to have going forward. If we're getting that kind of situation now, what are we going to be dealing with in the future if our infrastructure and our social infrastructure is not capable of supporting people through these kind of events? Sorry. We've also done a bit of analysis around the economic impacts of heat. This particular economic analysis is based on currently available pieces of research and trying to pull together what we understand around the different costs associated with certain impacts of heat waves. So again, we've done the heat waves and the single hot days, so the 3 consecutive days over 35 and the single day of 35. Health includes ambulance call-outs and emergency department arrivals. Mortality is a cost associated with the average life lost, and as I said, we have substantial deaths during heat waves, and there's quite a bit of research. This is actually all on our website if anybody's interested, the piece of research, but there's a figure that the Australian government has come up with to try and quantify the willingness to pay or the value that Australia places on a human life and the loss to the economy and Australia if we are to lose that life early. So that's what that's based on. Transport delays, transport infrastructure, our train lines buckle, and people are trapped in your train stations for substantial periods of time. The energy faults and obviously the blackout, so loss of energy supply. Antisocial behaviour is a very interesting one. There's a very clear correlation between extreme heat and the incidence of assault, and obviously that's a substantial cost to society as well, and it actually came out as our third biggest cost based on sort of current available data. And trees and animals. So as I said, during the drought, but also with the heat, we had some substantial stress on our trees, and that's actually a very big cost to our society. Some of the actions that we're taking around heat management at the moment, one of the main things we've done is our urban forest strategy, which is also on our website. And this particular strategy outlines our commitment to almost doubling our canopy cover by 2040. So our current canopy cover is 22%, and we're aiming to get that to 40% by 2040. And also diversifying our tree species, trying to plant more drought-tolerant tree species, so we're future-proofing to an extent our urban forest. But we've quantified the value of our trees, and we recognise, with regards to managing extreme heat and urban heat island impacts in Melbourne, that our urban forest, our green spaces, our green roofs are a huge opportunity to be able to manage that risk. We have a very thorough emergency management plan in place for the city. We've done a lot of analysis around the hot and cool spots of the city, so we've done some heat mapping of the municipality and identified those like-for-like pieces of infrastructure. So we were comparing roads with roads and buildings with buildings to work out which ones actually stay cool and which ones heat up, and what are the characteristics of those types of infrastructure, and how can we incorporate that into how we design our buildings and our roads going forward. We've done research around cool roofs installation in Melbourne and what that actually means for both the temperature of the roof. So this is the photo up in the corner there is actually the trial that we did out at Melbourne University, where we tried different cool roof products to see which ones were most effective in the Melbourne climate. And one interesting thing that we did find is that on commercial buildings in the Melbourne climate, installing a white roof can actually save about 3% of your electricity bills, because the building actually stays cooler, so you save on cooling, on air conditioning costs. And we're currently developing a green roofs and walls guide for residents and buildings in our city to try and encourage them to install green roofs and facades. Other actions throughout Victoria that are going on that relate to heat management in Melbourne. The Department of Health in Victoria has got a heat health alert, which we have a list of all the at-risk areas of our community, and there are processes in place to get this heat health alert out to those at-risk members of the community, to let them know in advance when we're expecting days over 35 degrees, and to let them know what they can do to manage that risk. And the Department of Health is also doing a lot around research and capacity building. They're taking on a lot of the responsibility, as you saw with the costs, the mortality, the health. Obviously, that sits with these guys. So they've got a big vested interest in making sure that Melbourne's moving forward in this space. And they've also developed a heat wave plan for Melbourne. The Victorian Government has a climate change adaptation plan in place, which I guess defines the direction for Victoria as a whole with regards to managing heat, but also other risks to the Victorian climate. And the Australian Department of Climate Change and Energy Efficiency has done a study on the rail network in Melbourne. Just quickly touching on fire, we generally don't have, we definitely don't have bushfires in the City of Melbourne. The City of Melbourne's obviously the business area of Melbourne, but as you can see in this map up in the top corner, need a pointer, but the dot in the middle, that's Melbourne. And the fires, obviously, were quite close. There were fires within 10 kilometres of Melbourne, so we were having quite extreme smoke and air quality impacts associated with these fires. But also, those areas are sort of part of metropolitan Melbourne. But the interesting thing about the fire work that's going on in Melbourne is the community engagement and community awareness program that's gone on in this space. It's actually been hugely effective. Basically, as you can see from this, the CFA, the Country Fire Authority, who's responsible for most of this work, they're very blunt about the fact that if this happens, you're pretty much on your own. That the authorities are not going to come and save everybody because they're not going to be able to. So the reality is these fires are a risk to people who live in areas that are surrounded by trees. You need to be prepared, you need to clear trees around your house, you need to have a plan of what you're going to do when the fire comes. So all of this work that the CFA is doing is around preparedness and community resilience, and it's an amazing model to help the community understand what the risk is and make sure that they're prepared and know what to do when it actually happens. And it's actually been hugely successful. So it's a very interesting approach. Just a couple of additional points. We've done a bit of community research to try and work out what our community understands about these risks. Because we do want to go out and continue the conversation with the community, but it's really important to understand exactly where they are at, so you can sort of have the conversation at their level. Do they understand this is even a risk at this point? And if they do understand that it's a risk, what do they want to do about it? How do they want to engage about it? So we surveyed visitors to Melbourne and asked them, what they were most concerned about, and they said drought and heat waves. And obviously, as you've probably noticed, that's been a traditional challenge for Melbourne, so that makes sense that they're concerned about that. But they're very unsure about where to find information and what to do during an event. And 63% of people said they'd try to leave the city during an extreme event, and that could be a storm or a heat wave. But I guess that's a challenge for us in how do you communicate with these we've got about 800 people coming into the city every day. How do you communicate with these people? Because we don't know where they are or what they're doing. And if there's an event, it's a huge communication challenge. Residents are most concerned about drought and heat waves as well, but also severe storm activity. And 59% said they weren't prepared for floods, and 22% said they were not prepared for heat waves. So a lot more people think that heat waves that they're prepared for. And 58% of residents believe they have appropriate insurance cover for damage in extreme events. And last of all, we surveyed our businesses, and they're mostly concerned about technological disasters, severe storms, and water scarcity. So drought and heat. I guess water scarcity, but heat didn't come up as much in that space. But 41% of businesses in Melbourne have an emergency management or disaster recovery plan in place. And one final thing that we're doing to try and, further the conversation that we're having in this space is we've developed a network. It's called the Inner Melbourne Climate Adaptation Network, and it brings together a number of our key stakeholders. So we've got Melbourne's water authorities, we've got state government, we've got our emergency management people, we've got our universities, we've got industry associations. There's 43 organisations altogether, and we come together on a regular basis and basically discuss the climate change adaptation challenges facing inner Melbourne. And the reason we've done this is we've been working in this space for quite a while, and we were talking to a lot of different stakeholders, and we realised that these conversations are all quite separate. We were actually having working on a project with one of the universities in Melbourne, and then we happened to be at an event, and we were talking to somebody from the state government, and they were doing the exact same project with somebody from another university. So it's joining up these conversations so you're not doubling up on research, and you're actually collaborating and achieving more together. So that's it.